On a misty night in October 1947, the luxury liner, the Durban Castle, sailed smoothly across the dark waves of the Atlantic. Aboard was Gay Gibson, a young actress with dreams of stardom, and James Camb, a steward with a checkered past. When Gibson mysteriously vanished and her lifeless body was allegedly pushed through the ship's porthole, a dark tale of desire, deceit and death unfolded in a mystery that would captivate the world. This is Dark Histories, where the facts are worse than fiction. Hello and welcome to Dark Histories, Season 8, Episode 22. I'm your host Ben, as always, and it's a pleasure to be back on the microphone. Today we've got an interesting kind of mystery for you. It's a story that I heard of a few times and sort of breezed over. And then I read it compared to an Agatha Christie tale and sort of compared to something that could have been an Agatha Christie tale. And that sort of flipped my sort of switches, I guess, and made me decide to look back into it again because I thought, well, that sounds cool. I was always a big fan of Poirot. But anyway, all that aside, I don't really want to bias you before you listen to the story. So we'll talk about that afterwards. But yes, let's get straight onto it because it is a slightly longer one as well. So yeah, this episode is called The Porthole Mystery, James Camb and the Death of Gay Gibson. South Africa in the post-war 1940s was a peculiar place to find yourself for most young British professionals. The war had helped fuel industrial growth and cities had begun to boom as people migrated for work and the somewhat illusory promise of a better life. Made a dominion of the British Empire following the Boer War early in the century, the country saw a significant influx of British immigration, especially to the cities like Johannesburg and Cape Town, where opportunities in the emerging mining and trade markets offered an attractive proposition to those willing to ignore the tensions that were quickly rising between the natives and the steadily growing British populations. Following the Second World War, the growing disparity between white and black Africans caused further tensions as white South Africans sought to install a segregationist government and black South Africans continued to have their social mobility severely suppressed as they moved to the cities in ever greater numbers in order to look for work. It was a complex, turbulent and politically charged period that would eventually lead to the country becoming an apartheid state, institutionalising racial discrimination and enacting a plethora of oppressive laws. Despite all of these tensions between the various populations, in the years immediately following the war, the major cities of South Africa still managed to create a strong enough pull to see large numbers of British take to the sea in the hopes of making a new life with new and exciting opportunities. Thanks to a gold rush in the late 19th century, Johannesburg had grown from a small farming community to a city with a population of over 200,000 people, and hosted one of the world's largest mining companies, along with a large European community who had made a home in the growing suburban sprawl, looking to fill the need for skilled workers that thrived with the city's growth. For many British, such cities in South Africa were seen as a place one could put the war behind them. They could capitalise on the industrial growth, and with the growing history of British immigrant communities, it was not so exotic as to be completely unfamiliar. It helped, of course, that the citizenship was easy to come by, thanks to initiatives that the government had overseen in the hopes of bringing in enough white Europeans that could eventually prop up their struggling rule. For many others, it was simply just a getaway with a therapeutic climate conducive to medical recovery. For those willing and well off enough to be able to turn a blind eye to the political issues that were bubbling away immediately following the Second World War, it was a young, exciting place to be, with a whole world of future promise. British immigrants sailed their way to the country from Southampton aboard refitted warships on the Union Castle line that ran passenger and mail ships weekly to Cape Town, and carried a significant portion of those immigrants that travelled to East and South Africa following the war. For the most part, the journeys were uneventful, sailing 7,000 nautical miles south, down the coast of Spain, entering the tropics, through the west coast of Africa, and docking in Cape Town 15 days later. With air travel still financially prohibitive for almost everyone, the Union Castle line served a pivotal role, linking South Africa to Europe as passengers sailed alongside mail, gold, grapes, oranges, and the industrial machinery that traded between the ports. This journey rarely made any headlines. until two passengers launched the Durban Castle line into an unwanted spotlight in the autumn of 1947, when an uncharacteristically dramatic voyage launched from South Africa headed to Southampton, carrying a young actress and a seasoned steward whose paths were set to cross in a tragic way. James Camb had been out to sea for the better part of his working life. Born in a small Lancashire village of Waterford in the north of England in 1916, he had grown up in a thoroughly unspectacular, white brick, semi-detached house in a small cul-de-sac, capped off with a communal toilet that perched at the end of the short street. His father, like most of the village, worked in the local shoe factory and earned enough to support James and his elder brother Tom after their mother had died following a bout of gangrene thanks to a leftover swab that had grown toxic inside her body only days after the birth of James. Raising his two young boys alone was not exactly the easiest and was only made more difficult thanks to James's propensity to cause trouble. It wasn't that James was a particularly badly behaved child, he just seemed to have a strong independent streak that would fairly routinely lead him into difficulties. Something of a loner, he was smart, confident and somewhat hyperactive, which often made it difficult for him to settle at school. Frequently, he chose to simply play truant instead. At the age of 10, his father had to retrieve him from the seaside town of Morecambe, 60 miles from Waterford, after he had stolen money and bought himself a train ticket, convincing the conductor that he was meeting a relative at the receiving station. By the time he was in secondary school, his father was struggling to cope with James's short temper and repeated efforts to run away. At a loss of what to do with him, he sent him off to live with his aunt in the nearby village of Lum, and for the remainder of his education, James bounced back and forth between his home in Waterford and his various relatives' homes in the surrounding towns and villages. James left school in 1932 at the age of 14 and quickly took a job, just like his father, working in the shoe factory of J.H. Whitewell, where he wrapped completed slippers in protective paper ready for shipping. Shoe factories were the bread and butter of the local economy at the time, and its speciality, thanks to the wool mills and cotton industry of Lancashire, was slippers, which had been invented and made in the area since the late 19th century. Following the First World War, the factories around Waterford were the principal employer in the area, and for James, as a recent school leaver, he was looking firmly down the barrel of a life, slogging it out in one of the 5 largest factories, marrying a local girl, drinking in a local working men's club and picking up a fish and chip supper on a Friday. Unsurprisingly, for a young lad with such a prominent independent streak, this was a future that looked none too appealing, and within a year he'd quit his job and signed on as a galley boy aboard a ship bound for New Zealand. This turned out to be a fairly ideal move, and a suitable outlet for James's adventurous streak that had given him so much trouble as a schoolchild. For the next 14 years, James spent his working life sailing around the world, visiting Australia, Africa, South America, Southeast Asia and the Mediterranean, and working his way up through the ranks aboard passenger ships, from a lowly galley boy all the way to assistant steward, where he waited on the frequently wealthy travellers, serving and delivering drinks, and generally making their journeys as comfortable as possible. There were difficult years in his career, and journeys that made him reconsider his lifestyle. His brother Tom died of tuberculosis in 1937, and a year later he seriously considered settling down to a life on land in Australia, where he took a job as a docker in Melbourne, and then worked as a steward in the house of a wealthy master who had ties to low-ranking British nobility. Unfortunately, his position was removed from him after what was officially recorded as a vague spot of trouble, though the rumours suggested it might have had something to do with his master's young and attractive wife. Newly unemployed, he bumped around Melbourne until the outbreak of war in 1939, where he signed on as a stoker aboard an armed merchant cruiser that saw him patrol the coast of Australia and then sail on to Hong Kong, where he briefly settled down with a girlfriend until the sea called him away once more, eventually landing him in Belfast in 1941. From Belfast, he took another job as a steward aboard a passenger steamer headed for India in what would prove to be a rocky position, seeing him promoted up through the ranks to head waiter before being demoted all the way back down to where he started, and then eventually being discharged in Karachi, some way before the journey's final and scheduled end. James returned to the UK in August of 1943. Now, aged 26, he'd already sailed several times around the world, and so, considering a settled life once more, he married the 22-year-old Margaret Clark McComey just weeks after landing. James had met Margaret 2 years earlier during a stopover when she had been working behind the counter in a tobacconist in Glasgow. Just 2 weeks after docking, the two were saying their vows in a registry office in Blythewood. Their shotgun marriage continued into a shotgun honeymoon before James took another job at sea and Margaret returned to her mother's in Aberdeen. James returned periodically, and during his time at home, the two appeared to live a happy life. James's first trip home came a year after they had married, shortly after Margaret had given birth to their first daughter, Evelyn. For the next 3 years, James hopped between his happy life at home and his working life at sea. And then in 1945, with the conclusion of the war, he took a job with the Union Castle line, sailing between England and South Africa, delivering mail abroad and ferrying troops home. Later in 1945, after being released from the Merchant Navy, he once again tried his hand at working on land, and he took a job as a sewing machine salesman. But after 3 months, he'd tossed it in and taken a job with the Union Castle line again, this time as an assistant cook aboard the Durban Castle, sailing from Southampton. Despite his routine, month-long trips to South Africa and back, he and Margaret seemed to maintain a happy marriage, and James seemed to enjoy the hustle and bustle of the life at sea, where he had always had a good working record with the ship's purser and been popular with the passengers. Things were, however, not always quite as they seemed. One of the primary reasons that James enjoyed his life aboard passenger ships so much was his ability to hobnob amongst the first-class passengers, who he milked for tips and, on more than a few occasions, quite a bit more. Described at the time as a very good-looking man, charming and an excellent steward, he had a reputation as something of a ladies' man, and had, for years, been partaking in seafaring flings with women who would, in all ordinary circumstances, been well outside of his social class for the time. Later in life, he described his time aboard passenger ships and his various relations with the female travellers, saying that he was spoiled for women at a very early age. Love came too easily, and I never had a chance to learn its real value. For many years before his marriage, and now, whilst his wife and daughter were at home, James lived out a fantasy life of carousing with the first-class passengers and doing his best to attend to their needs late at night. In October of 1947, he was killing time aboard the Durban Castle, docked in Cape Town, waiting for the ship to finish boarding so that it could start its long journey home back to Southampton. For James, it was just another return leg, like so many before. Within a week, however, things would turn very sour indeed, and his life as a relatively anonymous steward was set to turn upside down. Eileen Isabella Ronnie Gibson was born in the Bangladeshi district of Jamalpur in June of 1926. The daughter of colonial parents, her father had been working as an assistant foreman for the East India Railway and lived in the European quarter along with hundreds of other British workers who had taken to the east in pursuit of higher wages, working as a cog in the empire and seeking their fortunes. When she was 4 months old, her entire family, father, mother Eileen, and her 2 brothers moved back to Higher Tranmere, a district of Birkenhead in England, just over the River Mersey from Liverpool. With the local economy driven so centrally by shipbuilding, Eileen's father worked as a blacksmith, whilst her mother worked as a nurse. Eileen, who was described as dumpy, fat and rather plain as a child, attended school in England for a while, before her father took another job abroad and the family moved away once more. This time, Eileen travelled all the way to the Persian Gulf, where her father had taken a job with the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company in Kazakhstan. It was an interesting environment to grow up in for a teenage girl, and though her life felt intensely isolated, slow and repetitive, Eileen managed to occupy herself, filling the long days reading thriller and mystery novels, watching movies once a week, playing badminton, cleaning the house and drinking tea as a pastime. In 1941, however, with the war steadily growing, she and her mother were evacuated, first to Bombay and then back to England, where she finished her schooling in Birkenhead. It was around this time that she earned the nickname Gay Gibson. A clear fan of the spotlight, Gaye had managed to find what would grow into her purpose in life. She attended charity dances and was frequently seen as the life of the party. Over the next 2 years, she solidified her dream of becoming an actor on the stage. Living a relatively comfy life, the family had a piano at home, and Gaye would frequently practice singing, which she threw herself into with great theatrics. By now, she had also managed to shake the dumpy and fat labels, and while she was described on one occasion as not beautiful, she was considered attractive by many. Unfortunately for Gaye, her parents were strict Baptists, and they failed to see a life on stage as one worth striving for, and so they pushed her instead to join a secretarial college, rather than study dramatics. Gaye had other ideas, however, and when she signed up for national service as a nurse, she quickly transferred to the Auxiliary Territorial Service, working in the Intelligence Corps. Here, she was able to enrol in the Stars in Battle Dress programme, where members of the army, so inclined, could take to the stage and entertain the troops. A slight hiccup threatened to derail her stage career once more when her corps were due to be transferred to India, but things were righted when the plans were cancelled thanks to the impending conclusion of the hostilities. With the war coming to an end, Gaye remained in Chester and managed to land the role of the leading lady in an army play that toured across Europe, giving her her first real job as a genuine stage actor. It was a heady run, and in the jubilant atmosphere of the recent victory in Europe, the cast had a bit of a wild ride, performing, partying and drinking through France and Germany. Young, free and enjoying seeing her dreams come to fruition, Gaye seemed to enjoy herself, and she drank heavily and had something of a fling with a stagehand named Pierre. At the same time, however, her health reportedly began to suffer. On several occasions, she was noted to have experienced fits of some kind, where she struggled to breathe, choked, felt sharp pains in her chest and fainted. Whatever it was that was wrong, the turns, as she called them, always seemed to pass by morning, so she gave little thought to it, though she was fairly convinced that she was suffering from asthma. How serious this actually was is anyone's guess, and when she was demobilised in 1947, she was given a clean bill of health, except from the presence of an ear infection, which the doctor noted down on her medical examination results. Despite leaving the Stars in Battle Dress, Gaye only had to pause her fledgling acting career for a short period. In the spring of 1947, she travelled to Durban in South Africa alongside her mother to meet with her father, who had once more taken a job abroad. Durban, however, was something of a suburban backwater port, and the new home quickly began to feel like a drag for Gaye, and within 2 weeks she was travelling to Johannesburg, where she had landed a job in an electrical company, which went some way to allowing her to live independently in the thriving city, as long as she was able to top up her wages with the money from her father. Once settled in, Gaye quickly found her feet in the city's drama scene, and with her British accent, she was able to land a series of plum roles, acting as British ladies in radio plays for the South African Broadcasting Corporation. Alone in the city, living it up as a young aspiring actor, Gaye enjoyed a life at theatrics, attending parties, flirting with men and turning on her charm in order to play every bit the part of the dramatic lovey. Before long, she was cast as the leading lady in Clifford Odets' play Golden Boy, which had originally premiered on Broadway 10 years earlier. She took the part of Lorna Moon, the prostitute with a heart of gold, who featured as the love interest for tragic prizefighter Joe, played in the production by a South African man named Mike Abel, and rumours quickly flew about the set that the two were somehow romantically involved off the stage too. This wasn't especially salacious. At the time, Gaye was having the time of her life, partying, drinking, and naturally becoming involved in several short-term romances, including once with a fur dealer and again with a commercial broadcasting agent. Behind the scenes, however, Gaye was struggling. The play was not paying a wage until it went live, so all the time they were rehearsing, it was completely unpaid. Gaye was apparently not eating well, and many people thought she began to look sickly, too fragile and often very pale. It became so bad at one point that the rest of the cast actually had a whip round for her, raising enough cash to buy her food shopping for her. Her fainting fits had seemed to return too, and on several occasions she was seen to pass out. She dropped out of singing lessons, telling her teacher that her asthma and throat troubles made certain notes too difficult for her. Her teacher suspected tuberculosis, but it was nothing more than a suspicion. Despite all this, Golden Boy did eventually open, and to a warm critical reception, and Gaye especially was praised for her role as Lorna. Unfortunately for everyone involved, the theatre that they were playing in was condemned as a fire hazard just 10 days after the opening night, and the whole production was forced to go on tour instead. Gaye was less keen on this idea and she asked to step down from the cast, leaving the play with no leading lady, and effectively terminating the whole thing before it had barely gotten started. With her role forfeited, Gaye instead booked a room aboard a ship to England at the cost of £45. Before she could board, however, she cancelled it and instead booked a first-class cabin aboard the Durban Castle to the tune of £150. Absolutely unable to pay for the trip herself, her benefactor was one Charles Sventavsky, a nightclub owner and well-known wealthy ladies' man who claimed publicly that he had taken a business interest in Gaye's acting career and had furnished her with a letter of introduction to some theatrical contacts back in England. Rumours suggested that he had taken more than a business interest in Gaye, however, and there were whisperings that Gaye was pregnant and returning to England in order to have an abortion, a rumour that may well have tallied with the £350 cash that Charles had furnished her with on top of the first-class ticket. On Friday the 10th of October, Gaye stepped aboard the Durban Castle, a 594-foot-long, 17,000-ton ex-troop ship, refurbished after the war to carry herself and another 56 first-class passengers back to England. As she walked up the gangway, James Camb was busy making his final preparations in the galley bar, ready for 15 long, relatively quiet days at sea. At least, that was what everyone would have hoped for. Life aboard the Durban Castle existed at a very slow pace. Having left port at 4 p.m. on Friday, October the 10th, the passengers had just over 2 weeks of sailing to look forward to, and whilst it was hardly a luxury pleasure cruise, it was far from roughing it. With a passenger list of only 57 first-class passengers, those with the money to purchase the tickets could look forward to a fairly low-key journey. Gaye's cabin, number 126, sat on the left side of the ship on B deck and was fairly average for what you might expect from first class. 8 feet by 8 feet, inside was a small sink opposite the door, a dresser and a bed up against the exterior wall of the ship, with the porthole just above. Down the hall were the toilets and the baths, with lifts to take the passengers up to the leisure decks. The shade deck housed the ship's hairdresser and a large saloon bar, whilst the promenade deck was home to the first-class lounges, the bars, the library, the smoking room and the veranda. The first evening told the tale of what was to come, with a programme of dinner, music and then a late-night tipple in the smoking room before bed. Some nights there would be organised bingo games or movie screenings, with the occasional dance thrown in for good measure. At dinner, Gaye found herself tabled with 2 other first-class passengers, the 40-year-old rather dashing William Bray, an RAF wing commander who was heading home to England after suffering from tuberculosis while stationed in Burma, and Frank Hopwood, the slightly older catering manager for the Union Castle line. The food was nothing to sniff at either. Ice cream could be served during the day, a welcome treat for the tropical leg of the journey, whilst the dinners consisted of choices like foie gras, smoked trout, lamb boulangerie, and desserts of peach melba. Naturally, with so much time on their hands and such a small group of passengers, rumours and gossip made up a key component of the day, with Gaye taking up much of the interest, thanks to her youth, ostentatious appearance, and theatrical demeanour. It wasn't only the other passengers who had taken note of the young actor either. James Camb, who was working on the promenade deck, met Gaye on the very first morning when she ordered a drink from him in the long galley just after breakfast. Turning on his renowned charm, the two spent a short period engaged in idle chatter, where Gaye told James all about her acting career. When the talk turned somewhat heavier, Gaye told James that she had met a man in South Africa, but certain complications had stepped in to make matters more difficult than they needed to be. Taking this vague cue, James asked Gaye if she was pregnant, and she replied that she wasn't quite sure, as it had been too early to tell. She had apparently visited a doctor in South Africa just before her trip, where she had told her that she had missed a period, but the doctor had only said that it was still too soon to know for sure, especially given her health and stressful work. Before James left this conversation, Gaye requested he serve tea to her in her cabin later that afternoon, after she took a short nap. Aware of the rules concerning stewards visiting the passengers in their cabins, however, James assured her that he would prepare tea for her, and then if she rang for the bedroom steward, he would come and collect it and take it down for her. That afternoon, when the call came, Gaye asked the bedroom steward if he could allow James to bring the tea personally. Still unwilling to bend, but settling on a compromise, James went below decks alongside the steward to deliver the tea tray together. Whilst there, Gaye requested a supper tray likewise be delivered to her cabin nightly at around 11 p.m. James took the order and told her that he would arrange it with the night watchman who could deliver it to her. As the days ticked by, the ship forged its way up the coast of Africa, the temperature slowly growing warmer and the days somehow longer. James and Gaye came to know one another as well as any steward and passenger, with James preparing drinks for her every morning, whilst the two idled away the hours as Gaye elaborated on her life in Johannesburg, telling the attentive steward all about her experiences on the stage and of how she dreamt of where her career might take her. Each night, Gaye dined with Hopwood and Bray and drank in the smoking room, and then took Hopwood's arm as he accompanied her below deck to escort her back to her cabin and say goodnight. The two men, dining with her every night, did notice that her confident, theatrical nature was not always what it seemed, and they both noticed cracks, saying that they thought at times she seemed worried of something and even could be quite depressed. But still, the ship sailed on and life was relatively easy. 7 days after leaving dock in South Africa, the Durban Castle sailed past the coast of Sierra Leone, 3,500 nautical miles from Southampton, signalling the halfway point of the journey. That Friday, the 17th of October, the ship had held a dinner dance for the passengers, and Gaye attended dressed in a black evening dress and, in her typical style, bright silver shoes. Dinner was served, followed by coffee, and then music and dancing was scheduled from 8 p.m. until 11. With the night wrapping up relatively early, several of the passengers schemed to stay up late to take a midnight swim in the pool. Gaye, always one to join in the festivities, made her way to leave the promenade deck and head down to fetch her bathing costume from her cabin, when she came across James Camb, who called over to her, telling her in a raised voice, enough for several other passengers to hear, that he had a bone to pick with her. Apparently, he had taken note that she had not touched her tea tray that he had prepared for her the previous 2 nights, and he was not especially pleased. Gaye apologised, saying that the weather had simply been too hot, and so she'd only wanted to drink the rum. James followed Gaye down to her cabin, and the two continued to talk. Before leaving, James reconfirmed her rum order for later that night. Eventually, deciding against the midnight swim, Gaye returned to the smoking room on the promenade deck, where she met with her table mates, Hopwood and Bray, and the three chatted over an evening tipple before finally retiring around midnight, when Hopwood, as had become routine, accompanied Gaye to her cabin to say goodnight. It had been a long night, and the warm air made it difficult to sleep, and so Gaye, still not ready to turn in, found her way back upstairs once more, where she sat above deck, smoking until around 1 a.m. When the maintenance man, Bill Conway, saw her, he warned her against being on deck so late and suggested that she head over to the deck chairs in order to avoid being splashed by the water as he washed the decks ready for the morning. Meanwhile, James Camb locked up the pantry and finally left the gallery for the night. He had already laid out the rum for Gaye, but as he was leaving, he noticed that the tumbler had gone and an alarm clock had been left in its place. Recognising it from Gaye's cabin, he picked it up and took it up on deck, finding Gaye drinking the rum and smoking. He handed over the clock and then returned to the gallery to finish up for the night, and then, before bed, he decided it was time to make his move and headed down to Gaye's cabin. When he arrived at the door of 126, however, Gaye was not there. The room was unlocked, the light was on, but Gaye was just nowhere to be found. Frustrated, James went back up to the leisure decks and paced around for a while, killing time, before heading back down to try his luck for a second time, this time around 2 a.m. Finding the door unlocked, he rapped his knuckles quietly and then entered, and this time Gaye was there. The two drank rum together, chatted for a while, and then, as was James's way, he set about concluding his seduction of a first-class passenger. Back on A deck, the night watchman Jim Murray and his deputy Fred Steer were in the pantry when they heard the buzzers going off, signalling a call from one of the cabins. The call seemed to be coming from cabin 126, and unusually, both buttons for both the steward and the stewardess had been pressed simultaneously, so Murray sent Steer off to check out what was going on. When he arrived on B deck, he made his way to room 126 and knocked on the door. Then, not receiving any answer, he made to push the door open. As he did so, the door quickly slammed back in his face by a man he described as wearing a singlet, a brown belt and blue trousers. At the same time, a voice rang out into the hallway from the other side of the door that sounded suspiciously like James Camb. "It's all right," came the muffled tone. Shrugging his shoulders, Steer went back to Murray and reported what he had seen, telling him that he was quite sure that James was in one of the passenger rooms. Suspicious, both men returned to Gay's cabin and quietly they listened at the door, but after waiting for 10 minutes and hearing nothing more, Murray sent Steer off on a patrol and headed back upstairs himself to fill in the report. It was around 20 minutes later, at 3:20 a.m, when Murray decided to head back down to cabin 126. The whole situation had seemed off to him, and whilst writing up his report, he'd continued to feel anxious about the situation. Now, as he approached the door again, he saw that the light was on inside the room, but as he could no longer hear anything from inside, he gave up and headed back to the pantry, putting it all behind him. 20 minutes later, Steer made his way back to the cabin on his patrol and saw that the light inside was now off. The next morning looked to be another warm, calm day at sea as the Durban Castle rounded the northwestern coast of Africa. At 7:30 a.m, the stewardess, Eileen Field, took a glass of orange juice to Gay's cabin, as she normally did every morning, and she knocked on the door. Unlike the other mornings, however, Gay didn't seem to be in and had already left her cabin. She pushed the door open and found Gay's black evening dress from the night before hanging at the foot of the bed, which had clearly been slept in. Thinking Gay must have decided on an early morning and headed up to breakfast already, she set about straightening the bed linen, left the glass of orange juice on the sideboard in case Gay returned, and then continued on her morning rounds. 20 minutes later, though, as she returned to the cabin, she still saw no sign of Gay, and the orange juice had remained untouched. Deciding to trust her gut, she checked in with the head waiter after she finished up with her morning chores at around 8:40 p.m. to ask if he had seen Gay come up to breakfast yet. When his reply was negative, she began to worry a little more earnestly, and before taking her leave, she asked him to let her know when Gay arrived on deck. An hour later, however, and the dining room had been filled and then emptied again with the morning's quota of passengers, and Gay had still not made her presence known. With her concern getting the better of her, Eileen took the matter to the second steward, who initiated a brief search of the decks before escalating the matter to the chief steward. In turn, the chief steward took the missing person report straight to the captain, who ordered a loudspeaker announcement be made, calling for any information on Gay's whereabouts to be taken straight to the ship's purser. An hour later, with no fresh news and an exhaustive search having turned up nothing, the captain gave the orders to turn the ship around to scour the sea for any sign that they may have lost a passenger overboard, and rumours began to circulate amongst the passengers. The captain called a meeting with his deputy and the ship's purser to discuss the situation, and all three agreed that the most likely sequence of events had been Gay tossing herself overboard in the night. She had at times looked a little down during the trip, and several people had remarked that she had come across as depressed during some of the longer days. The captain's deputy, however, didn't entirely agree. He thought that she had seemed in good spirits during the dinner dance the night before, and had frequently heard her talking about her future career as an actor. As the three men theorised on the whereabouts of Gay, the night watchman, Sear, stepped into the cabin, having heard the announcement earlier, to inform the captain of the incident with the buzzers earlier that morning. At the same time, he mentioned going down and finding the door slammed in his face by a man that he was pretty sure was James Camb. In one moment, the atmosphere in the room had changed dramatically, and Camb instantly became the primary suspect in what was quickly turning from a tragic suicide into a potential murder investigation. Switching gears, the captain set about interviewing as many of the staff and passengers as possible, while simultaneously trying to keep the whole thing as low-key as possible so as not to cause a stir amongst the travellers. From Hopwood and Bray, the captain concluded that Gay had almost certainly been in her cabin, and likely disappeared sometime between 3 a.m. and 7:50 a.m. Interviewing Camb was as uneventful as could be expected. The punishment for a steward being in a passenger's cabin would have amounted to him losing his job, and so Camb denied outright that it had been him that had spoken to Steer through the door. I was not in the cabin at the time, and I was not in any passenger accommodation or on passenger decks after 1:45 a.m, at which time I got to bed. The captain was not convinced, however, and he ordered Camb to be closely watched by the rest of the stewards. He also ordered for Gaye's cabin to be padlocked and for Gaye's baggage to be placed in secure storage. Meanwhile, he put the ship back on its regular course, concluding that the likelihood of just sailing across a body in the ocean so many hours after it was likely to have gone overboard was next to nil, choosing instead to send out a radio message to nearby ships to continue the search as they passed through the area. Later that day, James Camb was sent for, and the captain ordered him to undergo a medical examination. Realising his position was hopeless, James reluctantly agreed, scheduling it with the ship's doctor, Anthony Griffiths, the following day. Before he attended, he wrote the captain a letter, which he handed to him the next morning. Sir, with reference to your question of yesterday, i.e. my whereabouts at approximately 3 a.m. on the 18th, I respectfully beg to state that after locking my deck pantry at approximately 1 a.m, I went forward to the well deck where I sat and smoked. I felt myself dozing off to sleep, so first visited the toilet and then retired. After getting into bed, I carried out my usual practice of smoking one cigarette. My last act was to wind my clock, and the time then was a little after 2 a.m. I did not leave the cabin again until we were called at 5:45 a.m. I am, sir, yours faithfully, J. Camb, deck steward. During the medical examination that afternoon, the ship's doctor noted a series of scratches on James's right wrist, as well as on his collarbone and right shoulder. The doctor himself thought they looked like cat scratches or from someone's nails, but James insisted that they had been self-inflicted after he had been lying in bed scratching himself in his sleep, thanks to a potential skin irritation. None of this really helped James's situation, and the captain wasn't the only one to suspect him. Whilst the crew had all been ordered to keep the situation as quiet as possible, it didn't stop rumours rushing through the staff, who, in the majority, were all suspicious of James, with some even scheming to have him locked up in the brig until they reached Southampton. With a quiet unease, the ship sailed on. The days passed without any fresh news, and only awkward whispers forwarded the story any further, as everyone gossiped on what was a clear open secret. When the ship docked in Portugal, the night watchman Murray wrote a letter to the captain, throwing even more suspicion on James, as he recalled the conversation the two had on the promenade deck following the dinner dance. Sir, last night F. Steer reminded me that I had mentioned previously to him in a conversation that I had overheard in the long gallery by the bar service recess between Camb and Miss Gibson. I heard Camb say, "I have a bone to pick with you, and a big one at that." This happened at approximately 11:20 p.m, the night before the morning she was missing. I am sorry this should have slipped my memory, and hope it will not cause any trouble to all concerned. For the captain, he could not dock in Southampton fast enough, and though the journey had lost much of its leisurely verve, it did finally reach its end a week later, on Friday the 24th of October, as the Durban Castle piloted into the dock at Southampton. It was 1:25 a.m. when Detective Sergeant John Quinlan and Detective Constable Mindon Plumley stepped aboard the relieved ship via a tugboat. The pair unlocked Gaye's cabin and slowly pieced together their own version of events. James Camb, clearly the primary and, to be honest, only suspect in the case, was interviewed in the smoking room just as the ship was moving into the port. James stuck fast to the story he had told the captain, that he had not been in Gaye's cabin and that he had never actually seen the inside. He showed the detectives the scratches on his wrist and shoulder, and like most everyone else, the policeman concluded that they looked much too serious to have been self-inflicted, just from simply itching oneself in their sleep. At 6 a.m, after a long night, they asked James to accompany them to Southampton police station, which he did, given he really had very little choice in the matter. With the Durban Castle now ashore, the news of the missing Gay Gibson spread quickly. The first Sunday after arriving, the 25th of October, the news hit the front page of the Sunday Pictorial, with the large headline, "The Girl in Cabin 126, accompanied by a portrait photo of Gay Gibson that took up almost the entire front page. In the centre pages, photos of detectives carrying furniture from Gay's cabin adorned a story describing Gaye as the youngest and loveliest of the first-class passengers. The detectives had reportedly found bloodstains on both the bed linen and the pillow. Henrietta Stevens, the passenger in the cabin adjoining Gay's, had told the press that she had heard the clattering of a tray on the night of Gay's disappearance, but nothing more, and she'd certainly not heard any screams or sounds of any trouble. Gay's nightdress was said to have been missing, and detectives had removed the door of her cabin for fingerprinting. But otherwise, the police admitted that there was very little evidence to help explain what had happened on the night of Gay's disappearance. As the news travelled across England and found its way to South Africa, Charles Schwentowski, Gay's mysterious benefactor, was quick to assure the police that he had absolutely nothing to do with anything. Meanwhile, back in Southampton Police Station, James Camb was beginning to open up to the police. Slowly, he began to admit that he had met with passengers in their cabins before, and even that he had visited Gaye on the night of her disappearance, but only at 11 a.m, and then only to ask if she had wanted lemonade with their usual evening rum. The police were keen to lean on him, though, suspecting that he had more to tell. During their search of the cabin, they had found strips of material around the porthole, just above Gay's bed, and gambling, they bluffed that they could prove James was in the cabin at 3 a.m. Crumbling, James began backtracking on his previous statements to both the police and the captain, now telling them that he had been in the cabin that night, and that Gaye had died whilst they had been having sex. Whilst in the act of sexual intercourse, she suddenly clutched at me, foaming at the mouth. I immediately ceased the act, but she was very still. I felt for her heartbeats, but could not find any. Terrified and deeply concerned about being discovered in a passenger's cabin, he chose to administer CPR himself, rather than try to find a doctor. But given he had no training in first aid, the 25 minutes he said he spent trying to revive the lifeless body was all for nothing. Realising his situation looked bleak and still in a frantic panic, he decided the best course of action open to him was to heave the body out of the porthole in the hope that she would be suspected of throwing herself overboard. Struggling to lift the body, he forced her through the small 16-inch circular window head first and dropped her 25 feet into the sea below. Switching the light off in the cabin, he slipped out the door and quietly made his way back to his own cabin, leaving the empty room to be discovered the next morning. This was a remarkable change of story, especially after he had stuck to his original story for so long. The next afternoon, James was charged with murder and formally arrested. It was now up to the detectives to find the evidence needed to prove that James had killed Gaye, and that she had not simply died as James had told them. The cabin door that had been removed from the ship earlier on Saturday had been fingerprinted in the laboratory, and a palm print found on the inside matching James's prints went some way to helping them out. At the same time, the blood specks found on the sheets were analysed. It was found to be of type O and presumed to be from Gaye, as it did not match James's, whose own blood type was A. Unfortunately, there was really very little else for the police to go on. In a desperate move, Detective Constable Minden Plumley took it upon himself to embellish James's original statement, adding the lines, "I can't understand why the officer of the watch did not hear something. It was a hell of a splash when she hit the water. She struggled. I had my hands around her neck, and when I was trying to pull them away, she scratched me. I panicked and threw her out of the porthole." Unfortunately for them, James was unwilling to sign off on this new document. The following day, Monday the 27th of October, James was taken to the magistrates to be formally charged, and a pre-trial was arranged for the 17th of November, wherein James stuck to his innocence, telling the judge, "I am not guilty. I did not kill Miss Gibson. She died in the way I have described. My mistake was in trying to cover up what happened. Witnesses already called could, I am sure, have told much that would help in this case, and witnesses in South Africa know about the state of her health." James was committed to trial at the following Hampshire Assizes and taken to Winchester Prison. To everyone else involved, the game was on, for both the prosecution to uncover enough evidence to tie James to the charge of murder, and for the defence to prove that James was an innocent man, or innocent of the charge of murder, at least. In the days and weeks running up to James's trial, the newspapers buzzed around the story like flies around rotten fruit. The News of the World had chosen to financially back James's defence, paying not only for his legal representation, but for private investigators to travel to South Africa and dig up as much as they could about Gaye's life there, and to try and secure witnesses that could back up the narrative that they were beginning to form for their arguments in court. The director in public prosecutions, meanwhile, focused on securing the expertise of forensic pathologists, Professors James Webster and Dennis Hocking, two of the day's most respected forensic doctors. However, both seemed to agree that, although strangulation was a likely cause for Gaye's death, it was not at all unlikely for her to have died in the way that James had described in his statements either. In Dr. Hocking's case, he simply couldn't believe that James would have been able to make up the medical details of his description if he had not experienced it firsthand. It all appeared rather like the case was going to wind up determined by who could obtain the best witnesses and form the best narrative in court, and the public waited anxiously, poring over any scandalous tidbit the papers could print, until the day of the trial dawned. James Camb's trial opened on Thursday, the 18th of March 1948, in the Great Hall in Winchester, a spectacular 13th century wing of Winchester Castle, and was an elaborate setting perfect for a trial that had caused so much of a stir over the preceding months as the public waited for the assizes to open. Tickets had been advertised in the local papers since the beginning of March, and over 30 members of the press had crammed themselves into a tight press cordon in order to bring the proceedings to a wider public. The trial was to be overseen by Judge George Malcolm Hilbery, a man with the legal system in his blood, having followed his father into law. He had worked almost his entire career in London, minus 4 years when he had served as a minesweeper during the war. He had been made a judge in 1935 and had quickly gained a reputation for being a very tough judge, or, in less polite language, as one solicitor described him, a bloody awful judge to appear before if you were defending. In reality, he was a pompous old man with a rather keen opinion of his own abilities. James Camb had managed to obtain the services of Joshua David Caswell, thanks in no small part to the News of the World, and his opponent, arguing the case for the prosecution, was Geoffrey Dorling Roberts. Both Caswell and Roberts were imposing figures in the courtroom, both having had strong careers, but it was Roberts' physical appearance that gave him the edge. Standing over 6 feet tall and weighing over 120 kilograms, he was as physically intimidating as he was mentally. The jury were chosen in the morning with little fuss and was composed of 9 men and 3 women. Then James Camb gave his plea to the court of not guilty to murdering Gay Gibson on the high seas. Finally, the proceedings began in earnest, with Roberts laying out his opening arguments to the court. It was a relatively short and simple speech, lasting just over 45 minutes. After warning the jury to cast any prejudices aside that they may have picked up through the saturated press in the months leading up to the trial, he went on to lay out the life of Gay Gibson, and then walked the jury through James's confession of pushing her body out of the porthole, which James had said he was fairly certain was dead by the time he was doing so. He then went on to include the embellished statement, just for dramatic effect. In summary, he laid out the prosecution's line of attack. You will not make up your minds until you have heard both sides, but in my submission, when you have heard all the evidence, the inference that you will draw will be that this girl objected to whatever advances the prisoner was making, and that she pressed both bells for outside help. She scratched the prisoner, and that for his self-preservation he throttled her. You will hear from the medical evidence that in manual strangulation there will be a hemorrhage and blood may discharge from the mouth, and you may think that, that being the position, that body being the most vital and deadly evidence against this man that it is possible to imagine, he took the only course which he could for the preservation of himself and put that body through the porthole. You may think that you can equally draw the conclusion that this girl, having objected, as I say, to his advances, he overcame her and rendered her past the power of speech, or past the power to resist, and then, living but unconscious, unable to resist, he destroyed the witness against him. The witness who could prove the crime of rape or attempted rape. He threw her, according to his second statement, into the ocean through that porthole. Following his speech, the prosecution then moved on to their long string of witnesses, the first of which saw a Southampton policeman walk the court through the dimensions and layout of the ship and Gaye's cabin. The captain of the Durban Castle came next, explaining to the court the untrue statements given to him by James during his early questioning. In cross-examination, he confirmed to Caswell that if James Camb had been caught in a passenger's room at night, he would certainly have been dismissed and likely would have had difficulty getting another job at sea afterwards. When Gaye's tablemate and fellow passenger Frank Hopwood took the stand, he did little to help the prosecution, confirming with Caswell that he felt that Gaye had looked tired, fatigued and worried throughout the journey, all except for one evening where he said she appeared to perk up. When the cabin stewardess, Eileen Field, gave her own evidence, she told the court that she had seen James Camb around Gaye's cabin and reprimanded him for encroaching on her part of the ship, but admitted that she had assumed that he had a reason to be there, given he and Gaye were a little friendly due to the conversations that they had had up on deck. Gaye's cousin wrapped up the first day, giving a short performance where she assured the court that when she had last seen Gaye, she had been healthy and happy and in good spirits. Unfortunately for the prosecution, the last time that she had seen Gaye had been 3 years earlier, and even then only for one afternoon. With the final witness stepping down, the first day of the trial ended in unspectacular fashion, though this, of course, did nothing to stop the crowds the next morning. The second day of the trial was almost entirely consumed by a long run of somewhat confusing and complex statements digging into the medical evidence. The ship's doctor, Anthony Griffiths, was the first to the stand, telling the court about his medical examination of James and detailing the scratches that he had discovered on his wrist and shoulder. He admitted that he had never been entirely sure how the scratches on his shoulder had been caused, though he was quite convinced that James's own explanations, that he had both scratched himself in his sleep or rubbed himself too aggressively with a towel, were complete rubbish. It was fair to say, he concluded, that they had been caused on the night of the murder. The wrist scratches were another story, and he was quite confident, stating there was absolutely no doubt in his mind that these had been caused by fingernails, and likely only 12 to 48 hours old, putting them firmly in the realms of the night of Gaye's disappearance. The scratch marks actually flagged up one of the central points to both the prosecution and the defence's arguments, and Caswell countered the prosecution's questioning that suggested James had been scratched by Gaye whilst he had strangled her, instead suggesting that the scratches had been caused by Gaye in something of a death grip as she fell into a fit and died. Sadly for Caswell, the ship's doctor sided with Roberts, though he was forced to concede that he had no experience of neither grab wounds nor defensive wounds caused by a victim during strangulation. Following the doctor's questioning, Detective Sergeant John Quinlan gave his own account of interrogating James, both aboard the Durban Castle and back at Southampton Police Station. Caswell hopped on his opportunity to paint the police with a bad brush, thanks in no small part to the fact that since the questioning, Detective Constable Minden Plumley had been forced to step down from the force thanks to a series of misdemeanours and a history of working somewhat below board. This made it fairly light work for Caswell to enlighten the court to the embellished testimony and helped him a great deal in painting the police as untrustworthy and convincing the jury to dismiss the statement taken from James entirely. The rest of the morning was given to Gaye's health, with the senior commander of the Army Medical Service stating that there were no records of Gaye having any medical issues, though they did admit that she had been a bit wheezy, which they dismissed, saying it was most probably a slight touch of bronchitis. Caswell countered this by showing the court records of Gaye's hospitalisation during her time in the army, forcing the army medical team to admit that they had never actually seen the records, and in fact they couldn't really remember much from Gaye's medical examination either, as following the war they were carrying out dozens of demobilisation examinations every day. Following a break for lunch, the next witness to the stand, Gaye's mother, Ellen Victoria Gibson, was one of the more difficult witnesses for Caswell to cross-examine. Aware that he would have to tread carefully so as not to appear callous or unsympathetic, he was placed in a difficult position when she gave a naturally and unsurprisingly stubborn and somewhat fairy tale performance, painting her daughter as an angel who would never have spent her time drinking or having sex. Gaye was only interested in furthering her career, she told the court. She was not sick at all, nor was she pregnant, and she had never had any relationships with any men while she had been in Johannesburg. Caswell opened his cross-examination with a careful tone, asking Mrs. Gibson why she thought Charles Schwentowski would have paid not only for Gaye's first-class cabin aboard the Durban Castle, but had also given her £350 in cash. Mrs. Gibson responded that Schwentowski had had a deep interest in Gaye's career and was simply backing her daughter as something of a business proposition. The final witness for the prosecution was the forensic pathologist Donald Tear. Tear confirmed that during strangulation, discharge of blood via the mouth would have been highly likely, and would have been consistent with the stains found in Gay's bed. He said it was too difficult for him to have an opinion on the scratch marks on James's wrist and shoulder, and then, during cross-examination, admitted that there was nothing in the evidence to show any signs of rape or attempted rape. He also said that he couldn't excuse the possibility that someone suffering from asthma might actually die during sex, though he did point out that there was little evidence he had seen that Gay was actually suffering from asthma anyway. And with that, the prosecution had finished calling witnesses. Despite the late hour, Caswell stood to make his own argument for the defence, and in an act that showed how weak the evidence he was likely to produce actually was, he began by reminding the jury that they should only give a verdict of guilty if they were beyond any doubt, and that his task that day had been made exceptionally difficult thanks to his having to question a grieving mother who was convinced their dead child could have done no wrong. With his pleas out of the way, he then went on to address the issues of panic, suggesting that, in moments such as these, referring to Gay dying during sex, sometimes human nature asserts itself and the first thing one thinks of in panic is the self. With his speech over, he called James himself to the stand, and the court collectively sucked the air from the room. After James had been sworn in, he wasted no time detailing his version of the story to the courtroom. He told the jury of how Gay was crazy about Charles Schwantowski and detailed his conversation where she had referred to complications and he had asked her if she had been pregnant. He then told the court that, far from rejecting his advances on the night of her disappearance, there had been absolutely nothing to suggest that it had been anything other than consensual, giving graphic depictions of her removing her dressing gown for him to show her naked body underneath. He then told the court of how she had died. Suddenly, she heaved under me as though she was taking a deep breath. Her body stiffened for a fraction of a second and then relaxed, completely limp, one eye just slightly open. He told of how he attempted CPR and of the bell ringing and the arrival of Steer at the door. The arrival of the night watchman, he said, only made him panic more, and so, afraid of being discovered in the cabin with a dead passenger, he tossed Gay out of the porthole. I confess now it sounds very foolish, but I hope to give the impression that she had fallen overboard and deny all knowledge of having been to that cabin, in the hope that the captain's further inquiries would not be too severe. In what was a relatively strange performance, he reminded the court that he was not panicking due to having been present when Gay had passed away, but simply due to the fact that he was concerned for his own job and future employment prospects. It was, perhaps, even less fortunate for James in that this performance was the last of the day, and so the jury had the entire night to dwell on just how callous and uncaring he had seemed to be. The next morning, James was back in the stand, where he had readied himself for the prosecution's cross-examination. Roberts began by asking James if he thought of himself as a truthful man. James naturally said that he was, which set up Roberts perfectly to then question why he had decided to give false statements to both the captain and the police for several days before finally admitting to having pushed Gay through the porthole. It was a relatively simple job to make him appear entirely untrustworthy, and James dug the hole deeper when Roberts then asked him why he had lied, and James admitted he had done so in order to save himself. Worse, he said he had attempted CPR himself, despite having no training, in order to avoid involving the doctor and thus blowing his cover. When it came to the steward and stewardess bells that had rung during the night, alerting the night watchman to the cabin in the first place, he insisted he did not know how they had been pushed, though he was sure it was not Gay who had done so, and certainly not to alert someone to an attack. As for the scratches on his wrist and shoulder, he insisted that he had not received any injuries whilst he had been in Gay's cabin, and then, moments later, walked back on this statement, saying that they may well have been made by Gay. It was a relatively disastrous session for the defence, and by the time James left the stands, Roberts had savaged any trust the jury might have had for him. All Caswell could do was to tee up James with an opportunity to admit that he was not proud of his actions on the night of Gay's death, and of how he deeply regretted what he had done. But it was almost definitely too little, too late. Changing tact, the defence next switched their focus to Gay herself, calling on Evelyn Amore, an ATS subaltern who had served at the same time as Gay, and who recounted an evening in July of 1946 when she had come across Gay having some kind of fit, where she was struggling to breathe. Evelyn had called the ambulance and accompanied her to hospital, and then, 2 months later, had noticed that ever since Gay had lost a lot of weight. Peter Arthur Dalby, another of Gay's colleagues from her time in the service, continued the attack on Gay's health by recounting a story when Gay had had some kind of hysterical fit on the floor of a coach following one of the theatrical performances. At that time, she had suffered from heavy and laboured breathing and had been very, very hysterical, and he then went on to describe her as an excitable neurotic. This might have been a troubling series of statements had the cross-examination from Roberts not forced him to admit that Gay had likely been drunk at the time and the coach journey had been a particularly bumpy ride, somewhat excusing her illness. The defence then unveiled the first of their star witnesses, shipped all the way over from South Africa. Mike Abel, Gay's lead man in the production of The Golden Boy, took the stand and told the court of his own experience with Gay. She had, he said, quite a long history of fits and passing out. One time he told the court she had suffered from a fit in his car where her lips had turned blue and she had passed out, leading him to a brief moment of panic where he thought she might have died. Unfortunately for the defence, given the similarity in situations, Mike Abel failed to mention that he had been having sex with Gay at the time when she had passed out in his car, despite having written as much in an affidavit back in South Africa. He had decided to admit this in court through to fear of his pregnant wife finding out that he had been unfaithful. Despite this omission, he went on to explain that during these fits, she frequently complained of shooting pains in her arms and chest and would faint fairly regularly. He also said that Gay had asked him to borrow £200 so that she could get an abortion back in England, and that most of the cast of Golden Boy knew that she was pregnant. Henry Gilbert took the stand next, an actor and producer from South Africa who told the court that Gay had always been open about her problems, and it had been no secret to the cast that she had believed she was pregnant. In regards to her health, he said that she was fairly highly strung, would cough a lot, and that he had personally seen her faint once before in the middle of the street. The final South African witness was Dr. Shube, who was attending to Gay during her time in Johannesburg. She believed that Gay had been suffering from asthma and had frequently been tired and out of breath. She also relayed a story to the court where Gay had visited her, worried that she had missed her period. Roberts' strategy during his cross-examination of all three witnesses was more or less the same, working with the prejudices of the day to show the foreigners as untrustworthy and only in England in order to get an all-expenses-paid holiday out of the defence. Though he did fail to discredit the doctor, who was convinced that all the medical evidence she had seen concerning Gay, including her own examinations, had led her to believe that James's story was completely viable. The court broke for Sunday and reconvened on Monday, with the defence calling an expert witness to the tune of James Mathewson Webster, a highly respected Scottish pathologist and director of the South Midlands Forensic Laboratory. In contrast with the medical evidence presented to the court so far, he said that he believed the scratches on James's arm were not impossible to have been inflicted during strangulation, but it was his opinion that they were unusual in the fact that they were uncharacteristically high on his wrist. He also said that he believed that James's story of Gay's death fit with all of the medical evidence. As far as a cause of death, he theorised that a burst aneurysm, heart disease, or even sepsis caused from her ear infection could all have been a credible suspect, though it was also just as possible that she may have died from something unrelated and completely missed in any medical examination. He did concede that strangulation could not be ruled out entirely, but a natural death seemed to be more consistent with the evidence. And with that, the witness parade concluded. Just before the turn of midday, Caswell summed up his argument for the defence, pushing the idea that James's story of Gay's death was not only possible, but entirely likely. He pushed the idea that his panic was completely natural, given the situation, and that, thanks to the evidence, the testimony from Gay's mother concerning her life in South Africa was proof that Gay was far from saintly. He also pressed the idea that Gay had been suffering with poor health for some time, and then finished by pleading with the jury once more that they should ensure that they are beyond doubt if they are to return a guilty verdict. With that, the room split for lunch, pushing back Roberts' summary for the prosecution until the afternoon session. When he did finally address the court, he argued that, although the medical evidence had been varied, all of the doctors agreed that strangulation was at least a possibility. Natural death had of course been a possibility, but with no evidence to prove this fact, it would have been a simple man to rule it out entirely. He then went on to make a series of statements that had not actually been proved at all during the trial, suggesting that Gaye had pressed the steward's bells and that there had to be a reason she had done so. He also did his utmost to cast doubt over the idea that James cared enough about anything to have sent him into such a blind panic that he might stuff a young girl through a porthole and into the sea. Did he panic? Panic? Do you think he is the sort of man to panic? Members of the jury, did you notice him in the witness box last Saturday? The greatest ordeal that a man can undergo, giving evidence on a charge of murder, is being cross-examined. Did you see any lack of poise or composure or full control of the thinking faculties? You can be quite sure that whatever Camb did when he put that body through the porthole, it was not done out of any feeling of panic. It was nothing more and nothing less than an act inspired by cold calculation, induced by a desire for self-preservation, to destroy the whole of the evidence against him. The judge then made his own summary, putting the question to the jury that if it was a fact that James had pushed Gaye's body out the window, what was it that he was trying to hide? There was no doubt that the woman was dead before she was put through the porthole. The issue was, is it proved that the girl met her death in that cabin in such circumstances that the prisoner could be convicted of murder? Several other matters have been raised in the case. Was she pregnant? Was she a woman of loose morals? Had she heart disease, which nobody could diagnose? And had she asthma? The jury are not called upon to answer the questions of these kind. They have to decide if it was proved that the death of the girl had been caused in such circumstances that the prisoner was guilty of murder. His long, drawn-out speech lasted over 2 hours and heavily pressed the jury to cast doubt on the defence of the case. Finally, when it was all over, the jury stepped out at 6:25 p.m, returning just 45 minutes later to hand the judge a verdict of guilty. The judge placed the black cloth cap atop his wig and instructed the court to stand. James Camb, the sentence of the court upon you is that you be taken from hence to a lawful prison, and thence to a place of execution, and that you there be hanged by the neck until you be dead, and that your body be buried within the precincts of the prison within which you shall last have been confined before your execution, and may the Lord have mercy upon your soul. When asked if he had any words for the court, Camb stood up and kept his speech simple. My lord, at the opening of this case, I was asked to plead guilty or not guilty. I pleaded not guilty, and I repeat that statement now. With the guilty verdict passed, James Camb was ferried out of the courtroom and transported back to Winchester Prison to await his execution, which had been set for the 13th of April, though it would almost certainly be delayed thanks to the appeal that Caswell immediately launched. Public opinion appeared fairly well divided, and James and Caswell pounced on this fact by submitting a petition that was signed by over 200,000 signatories to reprieve James's execution. In his cell, James spent the days reading books and playing card games with the guards, until his appeal was heard 5 weeks later in the Court of Criminal Appeal in London. The sitting was a fairly short affair, with Caswell arguing that the judge's summary had biased the jury against the defence. Unfortunately for James, it was entirely unsuccessful and dismissed outright. In a strange twist of fate, however, the appeal had still managed to have played a huge role in the case, as James's sentence had arrived just when the process of capital punishment was becoming the subject of some debate within the British government, and shortly after, a suspension of all executions was put into place. Launching the appeal had managed to push back the execution date just enough to save James's life in the end anyway, regardless of the outcome. Rather than execution, James was sentenced to life imprisonment and moved to Parkhurst Prison on the Isle of Wight. Over the years, he was transferred to Wakehurst Prison, then Dartmoor, and eventually back to Wakehurst, where he served out the rest of his sentence working in the prison library. He maintained a good record, and his life behind bars was seemingly peaceful, but his wife did finally divorce him. In 1959, he was given partial release and worked in a garage during the day, before he was fully released later that year in September, having served for 11.5 years. After his release, he fostered dreams of going back to sea, but thanks to his probation, it was a dream that he would never realise. Instead, he sold his story, that was highly edited and relatively valueless, to a Sunday newspaper for £2,500 and bought a car, He married a bar worker, and he took a job as a steward in a working men's club in Bishop's Stratford, just north of London. The job didn't last too long, however, after he was arrested for allowing his hands to wander on an 8-year-old girl, and her mother reported him to the police. Somehow, he managed to escape serious punishment, only earning himself a further 2 years probation. James just couldn't seem to keep himself out of trouble, though. In 1971, he was arrested once again for lewd, indecent and libidinous practices aimed at 3 schoolgirls that had been staying in a hotel that he was working in. This time, the judge was less lenient, and James found himself back in Wakefield prison for another 3 years, where he was once again delivered his divorce papers. Released in 1978, he landed a job running events in a pub, which is where he died from a coronary a year later on Saturday the 7th of July 1979. Until the end, he insisted on his innocence, and despite the disgusting actions in his later life, he managed to maintain supporters right up until his death, including Caswell, who always believed that he had told the truth in court. For decades after the end of the trial, and even for many years after James's death, none of the medical men involved with the case were able to come to any consensus as to the most likely cause of death. Without the retrieval of any body, hard proof of such a thing would be all but impossible, and no one will ever know the entire truth. Even if the body had been pulled from the sea, it's unlikely that in 1947 there would have been adequate forensic tests or knowledge to ascertain anything categorically, due to the length of time that the body would have been in the water. It remains today, as it always was, a true cold case, with very little to go on outside of circumstantial evidence. Whether or not Gaye really was murdered or simply died of natural causes is a debate that will likely continue for as long as the case is kept in the open. But whether or not any definitive answer will ever be given is doubtful, to say the least. And that was the story of Gay Gibson and James Camb, and we'll talk a little bit about that after these short advert breaks. Today's episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. I just want to take a moment to give a big shout out to everyone who listens to the podcast and say thank you for allowing me to have this work on Dark Histories full time and essentially have my dream job. This month, it's all about gratitude. And along with everyone who listens to this show, there's another person we don't get to thank enough, and that's ourselves. It's sometimes hard to remind ourselves that we're trying our best to make sense of everything, and in this crazy world, that isn't easy. Here's a quick reminder to send some thanks to the people in your life, including yourself. Now, BetterHelp is online therapy. Personally, I've tried it out, and I think it's an excellent service. I recommend, honestly, any sort of therapy to anyone. I think it is beneficial, no matter who you are or what you're going through in life. And even if you feel pretty confident in your life, I still think talking therapy especially can be a benefit. But there are always a few barriers of entry for most therapy, let's be honest. The nice thing with BetterHelp is it's entirely online and it removes a lot of those barriers. It's designed to be convenient, it's flexible, and it's suited to your schedule. You just have to fill out a brief questionnaire, you get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists anytime at no additional charge. It's basically just really simple to get into and get on with, which I think is excellent, because anything that removes those barriers and makes easier access to therapy is, I think that's a good thing. So let the gratitude flow with BetterHelp. If you visit betterhelp.com/darkhistories today, you can get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/darkhistories. Cheers. Welcome back. So, the story of Gay Gibson. There's quite a bit to speak about in this, I guess. I think probably I want to preface everything with the fact that it's absolutely clear that James was a fairly nasty piece of work. However, I was actually willing to entertain both sides of the story, and I actually thought James's story was quite viable. And to be honest, throughout most of the case, I thought James was probably well, we'll get to that in a minute, but I didn't think James murdered her. I didn't think he attacked and murdered her. And then I found out later in life he became a complete chronic sex pest. And this causes a quite a big problem when you're thinking about the case, because when you think about it, it's not necessarily a similar crime. I mean, I suppose they're both sexually motivated. What I'm trying to say is that the Gaye case is very much more extreme, and so you can't really pin him as a murderer for these crimes that took place later in his life. Some people have suggested that when he was in prison, it broke his brain somehow. I think that's complete nonsense. I think he was clearly always a very, should we say, sexually motivated individual, because there's nothing wrong with that. Providing the sex is consensual, there's nothing wrong with someone playing the field for that's fine, right? That if he's not married, which in his early life he wasn't, he played the field on the ships. So what? Whatever two adults want to do, that's their thing, right? So when we get to the Gay Gibson case, his crimes really were, firstly, the fact that he was married. That's not a good look. And secondly, that he pushed her out of the porthole to try and cover up the fact that she died. This is if we're believing his story, right? Another problem with this case, and again it relates to the sex element, is that it gets heavily bogged down due to its age, and a lot of the material written at the time is so incredibly prudish. The society at the time was so incredibly prudish that even the defense lawyers would have shied away from digging too deep into what they called unladylike practices, which is complete nonsense. So a lot of what may have happened in that room is not properly explored. The perfect example for this, for me, is that the buttons that were pressed, the emergency buttons that were pressed, no one can seem to remember how this was pressed. James is not really sure who pressed them in his story. He's not sure who pressed them. He says he didn't, and he doesn't think Gaye pressed them, but somehow they got pressed. Then the prosecution suggests that Gaye pressed them in panic when she was being attacked. That's one view, right? But if you want to explore it, right, sex is not so straightforward. Who knows what they were getting up to? Buttons can be pressed by accident when people are moving around. Let's just be, I'm trying not to be too graphic here, but I think you see what I'm saying. That to me is the most obvious example, but no one even approached this idea in 1947 because, sex was missionary and with the lights off, In fact, you can actually, an example of this is the fact that some people testified against Gaye and said that she was like a promiscuous lady because, at one point she may have given someone fellatio. Like, oh my God, she gave someone a blowjob, therefore she's like this absolute like tramp, which is, completely bananas to suggest. And the truth is, it was bananas to suggest, but it was suggested because the time that this took place was a prudish time, and you had to appear. It was all about appearances, right? It was all keeping up appearances. So they have to appear like this fairly sort of prudish front to everything, and so a lot of what may have happened just wasn't explored properly. Is what I'm trying to say. I thought that actually a lot of it was actually very viable from James's story. We'll come on to the porthole side of things in a minute, but I actually thought that was viable. He was friends with Gaye. He'd spent all week chatting to her above and spending time with her. She seemed to have made advances on him, I think, by sort of requesting that he bring the rum to her late at night. And then when he said that he'd get someone else to do it, she requested him specifically. That suggests something to me. Whether or not you want to go as far as to say it was an invitation for sex, she at least was comfortable inviting him into her room late at night. Whether it was for a chat or whatever. The point is, the two were clearly getting on relatively well, so we can say that. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that, she wanted to have sex with him. Maybe he completely misread the signs, and he did then, if we go with the prosecution, maybe he misread the signs, decided he wasn't going to take no for an answer, and, attacked her and sexually assaulted her. You don't know, and that's the problem in this case, is we just don't know, and it's quite a sensitive subject. So I think sort of digging too deeply is asking for trouble, really, because, like I said, it's a difficult topic. I think the things that we can talk about and stand on firmer ground are just like the truth of matters, which is clearly Gaye was not the saint that her mum said that she was. At the same time, I think she was probably just a young woman having a good time, and absolutely there's nothing wrong with that. But I think it does lend itself to the idea that she might have fancied a little bit of James while she was at sea. Why not? What else are you going to do on a boat at night? You may as well, assuming she thought he was single. Neither partner there was doing something wrong. Obviously, James was, because he was married. But assuming he'd lied to her and told her that he was single, and, neither party there was doing anything wrong. I don't think this is, I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't think James's story is actually that far-fetched. I think it's entirely likely that what happened. I don't really feel like I can make a judgment either way, though, because at the same time, the prosecution's story is equally just as possible. He could have gone down there, thought he was going to get it on with her. She could have said, actually, no, I just invited you down for a drink. He could then have said, well, I'm not having that, and, raped her or sexually assaulted her, or, just got angry. Who knows, right? So I think that is just as, I guess that's the problem. That is just as likely as James's story. So we're kind of stuck, right? The Porthole side of things, completely mad. What on earth was he doing? That is, I guess, goes very heavily against him, right? Because why would you do that? I can understand his panic, but it also makes him come across, every time he talks about it, and even later in life, when he had a long time to reflect on this, he still talked about it as if he panicked, not because of the situation, not because of, oh my God, I was having sex with this girl and she's died and no one's going to believe that I didn't kill her. It was none of that. It was just, oh my God, I need to get her out of here because I can't be in this room. I'm going to lose my job. It was complete self-preservation. And that, I think, says a lot about someone. That is quite detached and scary in a way, I found. And when you sort of partner that with a few other statements I'd read from people that he had relationships with or relations with on his boat, along with his later life and the creepy pedo things that he was doing, I think that puts him in a very bad light, which is why I prefaced this all by saying it was a bit of a nasty piece of work. That's the crux of it, isn't it? Like, do you then think that it was rape because of that? Or, a sexual assault and murder because of that? Or do you think that it was still an accident and natural death? I don't know. I flip-flop continuously with it. And the funny thing is with Dark Histories, I often end up on the fence. And I think it's because you dig so deep and you try and maintain a sort of fence-sitting position anyway, or I do, because when I write the story, I want to be as unbiased as possible. It's not always possible, right? Obviously, I colour the story with my own opinions and stuff. You just can't help it. But I try and minimise that as much as possible. So often when it gets to this point and I'm sort of doing this waffle bit at the end, I end up just not sure. I'm just sitting on the fence still. And I think that's kind of where I am. I think the problem is I don't like James Camb. I think he's a horrible man. And it sounds, from everything that I've read of him, like he was a sexual predator. But at the same time, I can understand his story and I can see it being a possibility. As mental as it sounds, like, I panicked and threw out of a porthole. Like, who would really think that? That's insane. But if that's just where his mind went, that's where his mind went. And I'm not excusing that side of him at all. In fact, I'm not excusing any of it. But if I was to say that he was innocent of murder, I still would say he should probably have gone to prison just for obstructing justice and disposing of a dead body out of a window. So either way, I think he should have wound up in prison. But it's just that whole kind of it's that moment, isn't it? It's that 20 minutes or whatever it was in the room, or hour and 20 minutes in the room, that we just don't know what happened, and I think that's obviously where the mystery comes in, and where we can just endlessly go around in circles, I guess. There was one other thing. So there was a sort of big fuss made about the fact that her pajamas were missing, right? Because James basically said that she was in a dressing gown with nothing underneath, and that she'd like stripped off her dressing gown and said like, "Come and get me," basically. Now, but the problem is she had a set of black pajamas and they were missing. No one ever found them. And so the likelihood is that she was pushed out of the porthole with the pajamas on. If that's the case, then why did he say she was naked? And see, this is again where we get into the awkward bit of the prudishness of the times, because firstly, James could have lied, which is the obvious answer for me. He lied in order to make her advances sound more, perhaps, more obvious to him. So I think that's a perfectly good example. And also following on from that, you without getting too graphic again, you can have sex whilst she had those pajamas on, right? It's not like it was some steel chastity belt. It was like basically a pair of like black frilly pajamas, shorts and a top. So, again, the prudishness of the time suggests that wouldn't have happened, and there's no such thing as passion involved. But who knows? So, because I think the obvious answer is that the pajamas went out the porthole with her, and that's why no one could find them. But it has led to a lot of confusion and people even suggesting that she would maybe been sleeping with Hopwood and left her pajamas with Hopwood and then come to this and all sorts of things. I don't think that's the case. I think it's much simpler than that. I think it's a much simpler matter. But anyway, that's that. I think, overall, it's a fascinating story, and I thought it was a good story. So, as I mentioned at the start, I'd read about this case a couple of times, but just briefly, in small sort of just single paragraph summaries, and it didn't really interest me that much. It interested me a little bit, but not too much. And then I read a blog post in the British newspaper archives, where they sort of covered some of the newspapers that covered the story at the time, and they introduced the story as being similar to Agatha Christie, and I was like, oh, okay, maybe I should look a little bit deeper into this, because I, as a kid I used to love watching Poirot. I remember watching it with my mum in the evenings. I think it was on Sunday evenings, but I'm not entirely sure. And then now, like later life, I still listen to the BBC radio plays like quite a lot just to get to sleep and things like that. So I was really interested, and I did think the story had some sort of Murder on the Orient Express or Death on the Nile vibes to it. But yeah, whether it's a murder mystery, I'm not sure. I suppose that's up to your perspective, right? Or your conclusion as to who done it or what happened, rather. I think I'm gonna. No, I don't know. I have no idea. I can't make up my mind either way. I think basically the prosecution and the defence both had a strong argument. Well, weirdly, I think they both had a very weak argument with no evidence, but they both made an argument that was plausible. I'll leave it at that. So yeah, if you have any conclusions that are better than mine, do feel free to let me know. You can get in touch with me. The email is contact@darkhistories.com. There are also all social media. The links for it all in the show notes. You can visit darkhistories.com also to find all the links, etc. And that's the links to get in touch and everything else that you might need. There's merch and there's ways that you can support. If you would like to support, I do have a Patreon, and it's very greatly received. I'm just a one-man band in this, which is a little bit scary sometimes. And so any support is always welcome. Yeah, the Patreon has like ad-free episodes, and I try and do some bonus stuff here and there when I can. So yeah, check that out if you're interested. Anyway, thank you very much for listening, as always. I hope you enjoyed it. And yeah, I shall see you again. We're coming to the end of the season now. I think there's a few more episodes left, but yeah, I'll see you again in a couple of weeks. So until then, take care, sleep tight.